Good afternoon. Welcome to this Sustainable Future seminar. My name is Jelena Ponuchko. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, and I'll have the honor to host this session. I'm also the Net Zero Challenge lead in the Sustainable Futures. The Sustainable Futures platform is here to bring researchers together across the university, and the main aim is to organize events such as this one, and also to support researchers through organizing workshops where we can help you brainstorm and potentially form consortia for future project calls. And next to the Net Zero Futures Challenge area, the Sustainable Futures platform also covers resilient futures, healthy futures, resourceful futures, inclusive and prosperous futures, and inspired and informed futures. And as you can see, we are covering more or less all the disciplines of the university, as long as they have to do something with sustainability. Before we start with this session, I'd just like to mention that it is being recorded. And if you have any questions for our speakers today, you're very welcome to type them into the chat box, because the unmute option is disabled. So the best thing would be just to type your questions, and we'll read them during the Q&A session after each of the presenters. Today with us, we have Professor Julien Harou, the chair in water engineering, Manchester Urban Institute, from Manchester Environmental Research Institute at the University of Manchester. And Professor will talk on the equitable co-production in the design of complex human natural systems. And our second speaker will be Dr. Catherine Walker, Research Associate at Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester, and the honorary researcher at the University of Melbourne. I will now introduce briefly what Professor Harou will tell us in his presentation today, and later on I will tell you more about Catherine's presentation. So Professor Harou will cover water planning in the UK and recent changes as an example of how decision-making in human natural systems has changed in the last decade. And as a case study, he will describe the WRE project and university's role in it. Finally, he'll describe how the recent Future Dams project tried to use similar methods in the context of international case studies. This will allow him to broaden the discussion and reflect on the global status of integrated assessment modeling and its link to governance and sustainability. Professor Harou, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, it's great to be here. Let me try to share my screen. Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation, and let me know when you can see my slides.
Yeah.
You can. Okay. Let me get me started here on my stopwatch. Okay, well, thank you for attending this talk. The title is still Equitable Co-Production in the Design of Complex Human Natural Systems. And you can see I put the logo of our recently finished project called Future Dams, and the DAM stands for Design and Assessment of Water Energy Environment Megasystems. And the question here that we were having in this 4-year project, and in the other project that I'll show today called Water Resource East, which is a project based in England, is how can you involve stakeholders and co-production processes in the design of complex human natural systems. And so we're going to be presenting both a technical approach and try to talk about how that technical approach was embedded within human processes and planning processes and governance structures. Okay. Right. So just a quick word about this, the Future Dams project. This was looking at these human natural systems at a large scale and trying to incorporate all these different dimensions across engineering and social and economic and governance dimensions. There was lots of researchers and partners. I'll skip that. And let me quickly, before because one of the key things about this talk is I'll be introducing a technical approach. So there's a technical design approach, which we then try to embed in stakeholder processes. So firstly, I'm going to just describe that process in non-technical terms. So, human natural systems are complex, and they exist over space and time. And so we need to understand them. And so the technique we use there is basic simulation. And that's the tool that scientists, engineers, and economists, and even some social scientists have been using for many decades. So the first step is understanding how human systems work by simulating them. In the second stage, we call it search, and there we're using these new artificial intelligence algorithms that help you filter through millions and millions, and actually multiple billions of different options, and package together those interventions which work best together. And so that's kind of the AI assisted part of this process, which adds a lot of value. And then the last one is, well, how can you make sense of those two previous processes, which are sort of computer assisted design processes, and embed those within human decision making processes. And so we call that stage the deliberation stage, and that's really where you have an iterative co-production by just stakeholders trying to understand what the design processes have done, inputting, and just iteratively repeating that kind of combined engineered and negotiation process, and trying to refine that. And so it's very much a work of progress. With that last stage of co-production and deliberation, we've been trying to implement that over several projects. And so I'll be giving you different of that. But let me quickly, just like 3 pictures that show these 3 stages of the approach. So the first one is real simulation. And typically, a lot of things that humans have to fund and organize we could call them supply demand systems, right? You're providing education, you're providing water, you're providing energy, you're providing transport. There's a supply and a demand. There's locations in space and time that require a resource, and you're trying to supply those. Now, in the case of a water system, it might look like this. Here's a network of storage locations where we're storing water, and then locations where we're using that water, both in rivers or at production sites like irrigation or fisheries or navigation. And so this kind of supply-demand simulation is a sort of combined scientific and engineering model with a human interaction model. And so sometimes people call these agent-based models. We're trying to see how actors act within complex human natural supply-demand systems. And so what you're trying to do is track the resource flows of this, whatever resource you're trying to provide. You're tracking the benefits they generate, and then you're considering multiple scenarios, political and potentially climate change. The second stage is this artificial intelligence process. So this is, the example I give here is the example of buying a house. Imagine that imagine you're interested, just to start, keep things simple, we're interested in the distance to work to a house that we're willing to buy and the cost of that house. Well, if you're a very scientific person, you might plot all the houses available on the market. So you can plot their distance to work on this axis, and then their cost of the house on this axis. And then what this plot is showing you is how we identify a special set of houses we consider are worthy of more attention. And these are called, an economist would call these the Pareto efficient houses, or an engineer would call them the non-dominated houses. And a person on the street would just call these the houses that make sense. And these are the ones that are the red ones. And these are for any distance to work, this is the cheapest house, right? So as you're getting closer and closer to work, the cost of the houses increases. And so there's no perfect house, right? As you get closer to the center of town, closer to your office, typically the house prices often will increase, well, at least in this case study. And so identifying this series of red points is a way that we help stakeholders filter through the millions and millions and actually billions of different options that are available to them for how they can make changes in their human natural system. to try to identify what are a few, and then what are the trade-offs that are implied by the choice they make, right? So if you're choosing this house rather than this one, well, you're making a very different trade-off in terms of the cost and the distance to work of that house. So the last element is, of course, this iterative deliberation, where we're involving stakeholders in this design process and trying to help them negotiate and collaboratively define what is the combined package of changes to their system that they would like to make. And so that's a lot more complex than choosing a house. That's choosing, for example, what are all the investments we should make in infrastructure in England in the next 50 years, right? That's a very big question, a lot more sophisticated than just buying a single house. And so this is the process that we've tried to put together to do that. Let me just show you, before we get into stakeholder interaction, and an example that shows that. Here, I'm just going to do a quick run through the technical approach of what this looks like for a technical system. So this is a study that we did for the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and it was looking at an example of new dams in the Congo, Brazzaville Republic. And so there was a river basin, and there were all these locations of potential dams that were being considered. I can see here some of our partners on this study. So you can build a dam at any one of this location or none of them. So which one should you do? Well, we worked with them to consider many different criteria. For example, where are there indigenous populations and how would they be affected by different dams? Different migratory fish locations and how many kilometers of those river segments would be interrupted by dams. Where was their habitat by different protected species like apes, and how the different dams would affect them. And so you can see that we had all these criteria that we wanted to consider. And so we have to move from a two-dimensional plot like the one that I show here, where now you can see that I'm no longer considering house prices and distance to work, but I'm looking at more general things like the resilience of an infrastructure system and also its cost. And so the reason why I show this plot is that when we do this in 2 dimensions, when we care about 2 things, we can plot this in an easy to see 2-dimensional scatter plot. But if we want to plot multiple dimensions of performance, we have to think of a different way to plot that. And so what I wanted to show you here is that these blue points, which are the ones that I showed you previously, were considered of high value and that we wanted to share with stakeholders. We're now going to plot those in a slightly different way. So for example, this one here, it didn't do very well on resilience, but it did well on cost. So it had a low cost, but not so great resilience. So that's now represented by this line here. It's doing very well on cost. So you can see here, the arrow indicates the area of good performance. So here you wanted to find a point that was close to here, which means that it had high resilience and low cost. Well, you want the same thing here. Of course, you want a system that's highly resilient and that's low cost. So ideally, we would get a straight line across the top. Unfortunately, there's a trade-off. You can see that trade-off here. And in this different plot, it's represented by the crossing line. So if you do well in resilience, you don't do well in cost. If you do well in cost and you don't invest a lot, well, you do poorly in resilience. So that's what these crossing lines means. It means there's a trade-off. And so the reason why I gave you this little course on multi-criteria visualization is just to show you how we represent these different options to stakeholders. So obviously we go through a whole training to do this. Unfortunately, here we have to do the training in just 15 seconds. But I'll show you now what the plot is that we showed actual stakeholders. It looks like this. And so here what you see is all these dimensions of performance that we would have talked to stakeholders. In this case, it was a single client, and they were seeing what are all the dimensions of this problem that we consider of interest. And then each one of these lines was an efficient package of interventions in this system. So in this case, each one of these lines represents a different combination of new dams and how they perform in all these different aspects. So obviously, this is something that we have to do with stakeholders, not in one go. We go through a training to how to interpret these. And then these are actually websites, so you can interact with this results visually with these filter boxes. You can see here the Ministry of Energy has placed a filter box and said, okay, we need at least these 7,000 megawatts. And then the Ministry of Finance has said, well, I'm only giving you $3.5 billion. And so you can quickly filter through all these portfolios of different investment options and arrive at just a few that work well. So in summary, this technical approach allows to track costs and benefits under complex systems and select different packages of options. So I've noticed that I went through that a bit too slowly. Let me quickly show you a case study on how we apply this, in this case, in a stakeholder process here in England. The project that we applied this with is called Water Resource East, and it's a regional water resource planning project. And many of these slides are taken from some of our colleagues who work there, Jeff Darch and Fitzsimmons. So the region here you can see, this is the region of East England. Unfortunately, I had a map there that showed all of England. So this is all of East Anglia. So it goes from sort of Cambridge, Norwich, and London's right here. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the map of England, but this is about maybe a fifth of the England landmass. And so it's a multi-criteria, multi-sector project where we're trying to select the changes to the water infrastructure system over the next 50 years that would suit those different sectors. And so this design approach that I've described is now embedded in a complex, even partially statutory process of stakeholder planning and design, which is also partly regulated by the water company regulators. And so this is a new effort in the UK, or in England in this case, where we're trying to create regional entities that review the water infrastructure plans that are produced by water companies. And so here's an example of a stakeholder and governance process that's wrapped around these design methods that I showed you earlier. And so you can see here the fundamental question is how do we justify and select nationally significant water infrastructure? And then here you can see roughly the plan. So here's the region that we're working on. Water Resource East is this purple region here that I'm underlining with my cursor. And so you can see here that different elements of the problem is that there's future demand, there's environment protection, and there's economic ambition. And so how do you select a package of investments for the future that respond to all those multi-sector demands? This one just lays out the challenge, and I just provided this to see how communications is an essential part of this. You need to be able to break down the scientific and engineering problem into simple language that's displayed graphically. Here's another table taken from that effort to try to show exactly what is the amount of water that's at risk and how does this impact different pressures, like here climate change or population growth or resilience to droughts. And so part of that stakeholder process is you have to find very clear ways of communicating. And so here I'm just providing some examples of how this problem is presented publicly. Here we have, this is just a summary, a bit long here, but it's selling kind of the ambitions of the WRE process. It wants to be robust and transparent engagement. It wants to be honest and open and communicate the expectations and the results of this co-produced planning approach throughout. It wants to train people so that they understand what's been going on and how they're having an effect by participating in this design process. It's trying to produce an evidence trail, and it's trying to coordinate between different stakeholder groups to minimize engagement fatigue, maximize efficiency, and ensure consistency of communication. So it's a tall order. It's a difficult thing to do. This is how the WRE is organized. There's all sorts of different groups that have different remits. And that's, in organizing those groups, and making everyone understand the role of each one is a key part of this. And this is, you recognize these plots that we produce, this is just part of it. So we have these on websites, and we allow the different stakeholder groups to interact with. Each line represents a package of investment options in the region, and then each axis represents how it performs according to a certain sectoral community. You can see here we're showing the costs, the public water supply metrics, the agricultural metrics, the environmental metrics, and the energy sector metric. And this shows you how all of this is, of course, embedded within these timelines, and so you have to stick to the plan. But you can see here that individual and collective stakeholder engagement is present here throughout the whole process at the bottom. Okay, and then of course comms is essential. Okay, so I reviewed that a bit quickly. Let me now go to the last case study. I only have 2 slides, I think, and this is a case study that we did with the Future Dams Project, looking at this new Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. So this is this is a single dam. It's not a package of infrastructure, but it's how we try to use similar design processes to try to see if we could be helpful in that conflict there that's happening in East Africa about creating new water infrastructure. And so this work is led by many people, but one of which is Mohammed Bashir, who's a PhD student who just finished his PhD at the University of Manchester. So he's provided a few slides. And here, the simulator, the supply-demand simulator here actually includes both engineering and scientific components, but also the economy. So it's a more ambitious and complex simulation in that we're simulating the physical system, also the economic system. And so again, it's these similar plots. You can see here, each line represents a different way that the Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia could share water and manage their infrastructure. But that here now we're optimizing, and we're looking at the gross domestic product, the GDP, and the power produced by each country. So I'll skip these conclusions. This is just the software that we use to do this work. And I'll just go to my last slides, which were, we need to make human natural system investment studies more collaborative and transparent. Engineers and scientists can produce these new artificial intelligence assisted design approaches. But the third point here is that the technical design approach is just the beginning, that we need to find effective ways to embed these technical design processes into co-produced and collaborative stakeholder planning processes. And that needs institutional design, it needs governance design. And that's what we've been trying to do in England, that we'll continue to try to do in some of these other countries. So I think I've already spoken considerably too long, 19 minutes. So I'll quickly go to send back here to organizers. They might allow us to do some questions and discussion, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julien, for your presentation. I see one question in the chat box, but please be free to post more. The question from Chris is, how does this fit with design thinking, where stakeholder analysis would come first or alongside the understand search process in setting up different criteria and the basis for comparison within the AI process, rather than the end process of deliberate? This was a long question, so I'm not sure if I emphasized parts of it.
No, I thought that was a really excellent question. Yeah, I think by putting, so initially I presented it as a 3-stage process where we were understanding the system by simulating it, search solutions, and then actively deliberating with stakeholders. That's actually, I realize now, not the best summary, because the stakeholders need to come up with the performance metrics which evaluate the system. And so actually the stakeholders are absolutely essential in that first stage where you're understanding the system. I didn't mention it there, but the stakeholders are actually intensively that, because there's 2 key things they need to define there. The first is the different performance metrics, which allow different stakeholder sectoral groups to evaluate the solution. but also need to define what they view as the key uncertainties and the key scenarios that allow them to be confident that the solutions being designed are robust and resilient future. So you're absolutely right, and I did present that well. The stakeholder involvement is in that first part, which is the understanding part. So thanks for that.
Until we receive more questions, I would like to ask one. I'm just wondering how critical was application of the overall methodology in real life conditions, because obviously this requires a very multidisciplinary, a hugely multidisciplinary approach. So how critical is it in reality?
Yeah, definitely. You know, these kind of simulated and artificial intelligence assisted design processes are quite complex, and trying to embed those within a real world planning process is frankly difficult. I just reviewed it very quickly at the end there, but one of the methods that we used is software. So we, by making web software and putting it on the internet and allowing people to interact directly with the results, that was really a big help. And so I think I provided very briefly the website there. There's a website called waterstrategy.org, and that is where we hosted the simulation. And so there was an ability for technical stakeholders to be able to access that simulation. And then the other tool, which is that multi-axis interactive graphic that I showed you, the kind of multi-dimensional viewer, that's an interactive plot. We provide that for free. That's at polyviz.org. So polyviz, V-I-Z.org. And that's just, available online. So we would often have, these stakeholder meetings where, there would be 50 people with laptops. Everyone would have that interactive multi-dimensional plot open, and people would be pointing, if you get more of this benefit, we'll get less of this. And so I think those tools really help. But I think where we still have a lot to do is how to, connecting those, academic or research design processes to real world governance processes. That was definitely where the challenge was. And we've been working with WRE for a decade. And so you definitely have to invest time and energy. But, it's very rewarding. And it's added a huge dimension to our research careers, and we've enjoyed it very much. So it's possible to be successful at this, but you really need desire on behalf of the stakeholders they need to want to understand and assess really technically in a rigorous way the options, and then there needs to be a willingness on the part of the scientific or engineering or economist team to really share openly what's behind the technical approach. So it really takes an interesting mix of scientific knowledge and stakeholder interest and willingness to collaborate. So I'm not sure I have the solution to how to do this successfully, except to just try and improve as you go along, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely something we all in academia have to work on, how to communicate it to the stakeholders. We have another question from Angelica. If Julien could talk us a little more about the software of multiple analysis, I guess briefly only if possible.
Yeah. So so what we're using here is we use these algorithms, which are artificial intelligence algorithms, which are called multi-objective evolutionary algorithms. And what they do is they mimic the process of evolution, and they help you evolve. They help the computer evolve good solutions. And so you need to have a simulation of your system. You need to have a system that can be predictable. So some kind of supply demand system where you can predict, if I introduce these elements of supply, how will that affect the performance of the system and its ability to meet demand? And then you have to simulate that and connect that simulator to these external search algorithms that use the artificial intelligence. And then the visualization was just simply, we use these open source libraries, these parallel axes plots, and we make one available at polyviz.org, but you can find those. There are many open source libraries. They're called parallel coordinate plots or parallel axis plots, and they're very useful. And there are several open source libraries to use those online. And we produce an online tool at polyviz.org. So yeah, there's definitely, I would say these are not mature methods, but they're methods that have been around for 10 to 15 years. And so I think increasingly they're being used in practice.
Thank you very much again, Julien. We'll have to move to our next speaker of the day. And I'm sure that all your answers have been very useful to the audience. Catherine's topic, let me just remind you, is From the Classroom to the Home, Negotiating Climate and Sustainability Challenges in Migrant Households in the UK and Australia. Catherine will introduce the Young People at a Crossroads project and tell us more on policy expectations for how students and families respond to sustainability-focused education in the UK and Australia. She will give us insights into household sustainability negotiations as reported in the project. And as a takeaway, she will summarize what we can learn from migrant households discussions and negotiations about sustainability. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. And hopefully everybody can now see my slides. Just shout if there's any issues there. So thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to be here online with you all. So what I'm talking about today, let me just change the slide, there we go, is a research project called Young People at a Crossroads, Negotiations of Environmental Knowledges, Practices and Subjectivities in Immigrant Homes at a Time of Climate Crisis. And I'm going to be unpacking that very weighty title across the presentation. This research has been funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, as part of their New Investigator Awards, and it's been conducted in Greater Manchester and Greater Melbourne, and there is further information at the link at the bottom of the slide. And the beautiful image that you see on this slide is one of a number of illustrations included in this presentation that has been created by the illustrator Maisie Summer, who I've been working with to co-produce a creative book from the White Pack project. This is in the final stages of production and will be available very soon at the link at the bottom of the slide there. So I've got three parts to this presentation. Firstly, I'll introduce the research project and policy background, then share insights from the project, and then I'll lead on to four implications from these insights that I think highlight the value of exploring how climate and sustainability challenges are negotiated in migrant households in particular. So just starting now with the policy and project background. It's become commonplace in recent years to talk about humanity being at a crossroads. This usually refers to a set of decisions or choices that must be taken to avoid one path leading to a future of unsustainable climate crisis and move on to a path towards a more hopeful and livable future. And as we can see in the two quotes here, the rhetoric of crossroads, this rhetorical device, is effective in highlighting the urgency. We see that through the use of the word now, but also the finality of the situation, because it gives the sense that once a decision has been made, there's no easy way of turning back onto a different path. And one of the things that's interesting about the idea of crossroads is that although the point that speakers are usually making through using this device is that we need collective action and we need it to be led by people in power, by governments, this crossroads works at different levels or different scales in people's imaginations, right down to the scale of individual action. So often we hear that humanity is at a crossroads, but what we actually interpret from that is that I or my family or my country or my community is at a crossroads and I need to do something about it. And the idea of there being multiple crossroads converging on young people's lives is one that I'll come back to shortly. One way that the UK government has, on paper at least, responded to the challenge of the climate crossroads is by the Department for Education releasing earlier this year a sustainability and climate change strategy, which comprises 4 overarching aims. And it's the first aim that I'm most interested in here, which is to prepare young people for a world impacted by climate change through learning and practical experience. And it's worth noting the acknowledgement here in the aim that the world is and will be impacted by climate change. So this is about supporting young people in adaptation to climate change rather than avoidance or mitigation of climate change. The UK government, of course, is not alone in setting goals to make young people and the spaces they learn in more sustainable and more climate resilient. Since the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, there's been a clear language of education for, so education for sustainability, for sustainable development, for building climate resilience, and more recently for reducing climate anxiety. And I just want to juxtapose this language of education for with 2 arguments that are quite commonplace in social science research. Firstly, that young people are not empty vessels. They have contributions to make to how education is conceptualized in decisions, and they have their own ideas about what they think education is for. And then secondly, we know that knowledge doesn't translate straightforwardly into practice. So although investing in young people's learning and practical experience has enormous value, it's not a straightforward case of training young people and then they go away and enact that knowledge. It's more complicated than that. So the 2 questions that I've sought to investigate in this research and in previous research I've done is, what do young people and their families already do and know that can build climate resilience and sustainable futures? And what challenges do young people encounter as they enact and negotiate environmental knowledge from the classroom to the home? Now, in many ways, these 2 questions could be applied to any young people and any household, and that would be a productive area of inquiry. So you might be wondering why the focus on young people, on migrant households, sorry. And this comes back to the point about multiple crossroads. So lives are made up of choices and turning points. And in the cases of migrant families, these choices are often particularly stark because they're shaped by places and times that might be more kind of dramatically different than is the case with households where people have lived in the same place for many generations. So taking into account these multiple crossroads in migrant households and in the lives of those who live in them, I argue that there's particular reasons for studying negotiations of environmental knowledge in migrant households. So partly this is because of a lack of research in this area. A recent systematic review found that most research on households and sustainable transitions treats the household like a closed box, rather than a dynamic social unit where there might be agreement, disagreement, negotiation, compromise. And then combined with this, migrant households have been routinely overlooked in research on sustainability. And where migrant households come into policy focus, this is usually about giving information to migrant households rather than seeing them as places that we can learn from in building more sustainable and climate resilient futures. But this is about more than just filling a research gap for the sake of it. There's a lot to be learned from migrant households. These are places where routine practices have been or will be questioned and reformulated as people adapt to new contexts. And they're places where parents and children have often spent their formative years in different places, as well as, of course, different times, with different environmental priorities and different ways of interpreting in climate change and proposed solutions. So for all these reasons, migrant households are really interesting sites for exploring negotiations around sustainability. Just before I get into the data, a few words on the research design, and I'm happy to take more questions on this in the Q&A. So very briefly, I and my colleague in Melbourne made contact with 14 to 18-year-olds through schools and youth organisations. Once contact had been made, we invited any young person who had migrated or whose parents had migrated to Manchester or Melbourne to take part in the research. Overall, 40 young people took part in paired interviews and focus groups, and we offered the opportunity to receive interview skills training to all those young people. 13 of them took up this offer and then went on to interview family members. So we ended up with interviews with 16 family members led by young people. And then separate to that, I did 14 interviews with teachers and informal educators. Overall, young people and their families who took part in this research had experience of living in 34 countries. And Maisie's visualised the journeys that families made in this map. Obviously, this map's quite complex, but you can see here how in Manchester, there were quite a number of people with African, Middle Eastern and South Asian backgrounds. And then in Melbourne, again, South Asian and African backgrounds, but also Southeast Asian and South American backgrounds. And in both cases, both countries, there were some families that had migrated between Australia and the UK. So, having done an introduction to the research, I want to now share 2 insights into how young people and their families negotiated climate and sustainability challenges. I'm focusing on just one area of household practice, and that's meat consumption. And this was because it was something that young people brought up quite a lot, an area that they felt they could influence, but also one of potential conflict with other family members. The first insight here will come as no surprise to my colleagues in the Sustainable Consumption Institute, and that's that practices are not static, but rather they're layered with different meanings that change over time and place. So this is by no means a new research insight, but I argue that intergenerational negotiations in migrant households offer new ways of seeing this layering, and particularly how time and place come together and overlap. So in the examples here, we have Zach, who's in Melbourne, and Hafsa in Manchester, and they did a paired interview together. And they both talked about their concerns about meat consumption. Zach shared that he had started an online campaign for young people about the impacts of diets on the planet in response to research that he had done online about climate change to supplement his school learning. And he talked about being passionate about sharing this knowledge with other young people. Hafsa shared in the same interview a more general sense that meat is bad for the planet, which she said partly had come from school, but also things she'd just been told. And she admitted that her knowledge of this was incomplete, and in contrast to the Department for Education's strategy to prepare young people for living with climate change, Hafsa said that in school they hadn't been told what to do, just that meat was bad. And then this shows the strength of the association between climate change and meat consumption in young people's minds, because even in the absence of being fully educated on this, they were drawing this conclusion. And this association between meat and climate was also made by Lisa, whose family had migrated to Melbourne from India. And she talked about how her grandparents' vegetarianism and the family's avoidance of beef for religious reasons would be affecting climate change in a positive way, even though this wasn't specifically for climate change, it was a religious choice. So from these 3 young people, we can see something of the changing ideas about meat consumption and how they travel across different places. We see a strong message that consumption, and it's interesting that Zach in particular draws out consumption rather than production of meat as the problem here, is contributing to climate change and therefore is something that's bad. And then in Lisa's case, we see this overlaid onto a set of religious beliefs that long predate more recent understandings of the greenhouse gas impacts of red meat consumption and production. And this set of religious beliefs was once contained to a particular region of the world, but now, of course, has travelled more widely through migration. And then this layering of the different understandings over times and places becomes more complex as we turn to the second insight from the project, which is that households are sites of collaboration, compromise and potential conflict where different generations can influence each other. So again, in Zach and Hafsa's interview, they both talked about how they had broached their personal attempts to reduce meat consumption with other members of the household. So Hafsa talked about avoiding conflict with other household members by becoming selectively vegetarian. She explains that she felt unable to go full vegetarian due to her positioning as a member of a Middle Eastern and South Asian household, where, in her words, there's a very big meat-eating culture. Elsewhere in the interview, Hafsa explained that her mother was helping her to keep her selective vegetarianism quiet from her father. As well as an example of collaboration between mother and daughter here, we see an avoidance of conflict. And this is also a clear illustration of how consumption practices are shaped by cultural frameworks in place in particular settings. So for Hafsa, what's considered to be good for the environment is constrained by the cultural value given to meat in her household. So it's only when she leaves that household in the future that she feels she can become a full vegetarian. And then Zach, in the same interview, shared that he'd come up against some resistance from his grandparents to the time that he was putting into his online campaign to reduce meat consumption. And he shared elsewhere that he was trying to encourage his Chinese-born grandparents to cook less meat by appealing to their frugality. And in this way, he and his grandparents had reached a reluctant agreement or compromise. Another example of compromise came up in Lisa's interview with her mother, where they were talking about differences between life in India and Australia, and the fact that it's law in India to not kill cows in some parts of India. And then, having acknowledged that this is not a law in Australia, Lisa's mother goes on to expand on this and explain that she and her partner have never restricted their Australian-born children's consumption of beef outside of the home. So, as with Hafsa's example here, we can see how particular cultural values are bounded to the household, whilst outside the household, Lisa and her siblings are free to eat beef, even though, as the mother says, they don't seem to like it that much. So Lisa's mother explains this decision in relation to her experience as a kinder instructor and her sympathy for children with religious restrictions who wanted to eat the meals that the other children were eating. And this shows Lisa's mother's reading that cultural values that are in place, in particular in individual homes, can be restrictive when they're applied in other places where different cultures come together. And she uses this example to explain the family's decision or compromise made with her children in relation to meat eating in the wider cultural milieu in which they're growing up. So where I need to wrap up now. So just some implications of this. And the first thing to say is that studying intergenerational negotiations is a way to open up households, which, as we noted before, are often treated analytically as a single closed unit without attention given to their internal dynamics, including collaboration, conflict, and compromise. And then digging into this, there's a lot to learn from migrant households in particular, as these negotiations of practice and their underlying cultural values take in a wider expanse of lived experiences than is the case for households where members grew up in the same place. The insights here also show that it's important not to romanticize migrant practices or imagine that they will stay static after people have migrated. Just as we see young people influencing parents to eat less meat, we also see parents making decisions not to restrict children's consumption. And this is just one example of how migrants' practices change over time and particularly across generations in ways that can be more carbon intensive as well as less so. And then finally, coming back to education 4, the research shows how learning from a broader diversity of experiences across times and places can enhance sustainability and climate resilience by showing what households, and particularly young people as members of those households who bring diverse perspectives into classrooms, already know and do. And if you want to know more about how young people and their families' perspectives can influence sustainability and climate change education, do look out for the book Stories of Climate Change Education, Action and Adaptation, which will be uploaded to the link at the bottom of this slide in the coming weeks. So I've included that link just there at the bottom, and then these are references for the things that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So I'll stop there, stop sharing my slides now.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'd just like to invite our audience to pose their questions. Until there are some, let me ask you a question. So what can we learn from the difference between Manchester and Melbourne sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't have a chance to cover that. So I think it's always interesting in comparative research that you obviously are drawing on a sort of a wider range of perspectives, but sometimes it's by kind of putting those alongside one another that you see things that are absent or present across the two contexts. So I think it was interesting that young people often we're talking about some of the same campaigns that they'd seen online and the same personalities. People like Greta Thunberg, of course, came up quite a bit. And that was the same between Manchester and Melbourne. Interestingly, the bushfires at the end of 2019 were talked about quite a lot by young people, obviously in Melbourne, but also in Manchester as well, as kind of a real sort of turning point in how seriously they were taking climate change. So I think it's interesting to see how kind of ideas and messages travel. But then I think when in those conversations, young people in Melbourne were kind of talking about the much more free lived experience, and there definitely was a sense in Melbourne that that this wasn't something that was future orientated, that this was something that was kind of happening maybe more immediately. So I think the sort of climatic differences between the two cities was quite interesting too.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. We have two questions now in the chat box. The first one is, how have you absorbed the views of the parents, carers, into the research, and in what ways do they press for more sustainable lifestyles?
Yeah, so I guess I'm still kind of reflecting on this really fantastic and rich kind of body of data that I've got from this project. I would say probably so far I have focused more on young people's perspectives, I guess because I kind of started out working with them. I've kind of had some of the data maybe for a bit longer, but I think, yeah, young people's parents did make really, really important contributions, and obviously contributions informed by different lived experience to their children. One article that we have started working on from the project is about how young people and parents saw responsibility differently. So with young people, kind of they were often quite dismissive of governments, potentially because of the times they've lived through. They don't have very much trust of governments, whereas parents seem to sort of place maybe more expectations on what governments should be doing. And often when they migrated from countries that had governments that were facing kind of particular challenges such as poverty, lack of resources, the parents were sometimes a bit more understanding of the limitations, but nonetheless kind of had expectations of what government should do. Whereas I think young people were a bit more kind of dismissive overall of kind of the role of governments and saw it as things that they should be taking on to do themselves. So I guess, yeah, in terms of how we're kind of working with the data, definitely I think there's scope for maybe more kind of comparisons across generations to be coming out, and potentially scope to work specifically with parents' views. But I would say overall, I'm probably going to be foregrounding the young people's views in the first publications I'm going to be working on from the project.
Thank you. And the other question is, could you see this information, could you use this information to develop a program or information package which targets schools with higher diversity of pupils?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something that I am working on at the moment with teachers and with environmental education consultants. So we're not necessarily putting together a kind of a set program on sort of how to do things, but we are, so in this project book, we have put together a set of thematic summaries which draws on young people's experiences of education and their ideas for how climate change education could be different. And then it's got the young people's reflections from the young people themselves as well. So it's got kind of their first-hand voices as well, kind of coming through. And that's got recommendations or ideas for schools to work with. What I potentially want to work on as well is developing a resource for schools where on sort of how to use interview training with young people, and how young people could then go away and interview their parents, come back into classrooms and kind of talk about the different things that parents said. And so I think kind of offering not necessarily a very kind of, you know, rigid, this is what you should be doing, but this offering kind of insights into what can be done to diversify education. That's definitely at the core of kind of what I'm trying to do with this project.
Thank you very much, Catherine, again, and thank you to the audience for their questions. There are no more questions, and I'm also aware of the time. We'll have to close this webinar slowly. Thank you to Julien and Catherine, who gave us two perspectives of sustainability, one on, let's say, water engineering and the other one on education. If anyone would like to know more about the sustainable futures, we'll drop a link to the website soon, so either Lauren or myself. And also, in particular, if you are working in the area of net zero, you are very welcome to get in touch with me, and we can then move on with the conversation. Thank you again all for joining. You can see the sign up link in the chat box, and see you next time.